Hi, everybody. It's me, Miss Denny, your favorite children's librarian. Here we are for another week of the weekly read. And we are going to jump back into the original version of The Boxcar Children by Gertrude C. Werner. Last week we read chapters 1 and 2, and those are available on our YouTube page right here on the playlist, the weekly read. So check those out if you haven't listened to those yet. And we're going to start today with chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called Shelter. Here we go. When Jess opened her eyes, it must have been about 10 o'clock in the morning. She sat up and looked all around her. She could dimly see in the opening where they had come into the woods. She looked around to see that her family was still safely by her. Then she looked up at the sky. At first, she thought it must still be night. And then she realized that the darkness was caused by an approaching storm. Whatever shall we do now? Demanded Jess of the air. She got up and looked in every direction for shelter. She even walked quite a little way into the woods and down a hill. And there she stood, not knowing what to do next. I shall have to wake Henry up, she said at last. Only how I hate to. As she spoke, she glanced into the forest, and her feet felt as if they were nailed to the ground. She could not stir. Faintly outlined among the trees, Jess saw an old freight or boxcar. Her first thought was one of fear. Her second, hope for shelter. As she thought of shelter, her feet moved and she stumbled toward it. It really was a freight car. She felt of it. It stood on rusty, broken rails, which were nearly covered with dead leaves. Then the thunder cracked overhead. Jess came to her usual senses and started back for Henry, flying like the wind. He was awake, looking anxiously overhead. He had not noticed that Jess was missing. Come, panted Jess, I found a place. Hurry, hurry. Henry did not stop to ask questions. He picked up Benny, telling Violet to gather up the hay. Then they ran headlong through the thick underbrush in Jess's wake, seeing their way only too well by the sharp flashes of lightning. It's beginning to sprinkle, gasped Henry. We'll get there all right, Jess shouted back. It's not far. We'll be all ready to help me open the door when we get there. By sheer good fortune, a big tree stump stood under the door of the freight car, where the children never could have opened it. As it was, Jess sprang on the stump, and Henry, pausing to lay Benny down, did likewise. Together, they rolled back the heavy door about a foot. That's enough, panted Jess. I'll get in, and you hand Benny up to me. No, said Henry quietly. I must see first if anyone is in there. It will rain, protested Jess. Nothing will hurt me. But she knew it was useless to argue with Henry, so she hastily groped in the bag for the matches and handed them to her brother. It must be confessed that Jess held her breath while Henry struck one and peered about inside the car. All's well, he reported. Come in, everybody. Violet passed the hay up to her brother and crawled in herself. Then Jess handed Benny up like a package of groceries, and taking one last look at the angry sky and waving trees, she climbed in after him. The two children managed to roll the door back so that the crack was completely closed before the storm broke. But at that very instant, it broke with a vengeance. It seemed to the children that the sky would split. So sharp were the cracks of thunder. But not a drop of rain reached them in their roomy retreat. They could see nothing at all, for the freight car was tightly made and all outside was nearly as black as night. Through it all, Benny slept on. Presently, the thunder grew fainter and rumbled away down the valley, and the rain spent itself. Only the drip from the trees on the top of the car could be heard. Then Henry ventured to open the door. He knelt on his hands and knees and thrust his head out. The warm sunlight was filtering through the trees, making golden pools of light here and there. The beautiful trees, pines and white birches and oaks, grew thickly around, and the ground was carpeted with flowers and wonderful ferns more than a yard high. But most miraculous of all, there was a miniature waterfall, small but perfect, where the same little brown brook fell gracefully over some ledges and danced away down the glen. In an instant, Jess and Violet were looking over Henry's shoulder at the pretty sight. "How different everything looks with the sun shining," exclaimed Jess. "Things will soon be dry at this rate." "It must be about noon," observed Henry, looking at the sun. And as he spoke, the faint echo of mill bells in the distance was heard. "Henry," said Jess sharply, "let's live here." "Live here?" repeated Henry dully. "Yes, why not?" replied Jess. "Nobody uses this car, and it's warm and dry. We're quite far away, and yet we are near enough to a town so we can buy things." "And we're near the water," added Violet. Jess hugged her sister. "So we are, little mouse," she said. "The most important thing of all." "But," began Henry. "Please, Henry," said Jess excitedly, "I could make this old freight car into the dearest little house with beds and chairs and a table and dishes." "I'd like to live here too," said a determined little voice from the corner, "but I don't want to unless—" "Unless what?" asked Henry, panic-stricken. "Unless I can have my dinner," Benny finished anxiously. "We'll have something to eat right away, old fellow," said Henry, thankful it was no worse, for he himself was beginning to see what a cozy home the car really would make. Jess cut the last loaf of bread into 4 pieces, but alas, it was very dry. The children were so hungry that they tore it with their teeth like little dogs, but Benny was nearly crying. He did not actually cry, however, for just at the crucial moment, Violet started a funny story about Cinnamon Bear eating bread crusts out of the ash can. "He ought to have milk," said Jess quietly to Henry. "He shall have milk," replied Henry. "I'll go down the railroad track to the town and get some." Jess counted out $1 and 10 dimes and handed it to Henry. "By the time our $4 are gone, you will have some work to do," she said. All the same, Henry did not like to begin his trip. "How I hate to leave you alone, Jess," he said miserably. "Oh, don't you worry," began Jess lightly. "We'll have a surprise for you when you come back. You just wait and see." And she nodded her head wisely as Henry walked slowly off through the woods. The moment he was out of sight, she turned to Benny and Violet. "Now, children," she said, "what do you think we're going to do? Do you know what I saw over in the sunny part of the woods? I saw some blueberries." "Oh, oh," cried Benny, who knew what blueberries were. "Can't we have some blueberries and milk?" "We certainly," began Jess, but the sentence was never finished, for a sharp crackle of dry leaves was heard. Something was moving in the woods. You better read chapter 4 to find out what it is. Chapter 4 is called A New Home. "Keep still," whispered Jess. Benny obeyed. The 3 children were motionless as stone images, huddled inside the freight car. Jess opened her mouth in order to breathe at all. Her heart was thumping so wildly. She watched like a cat through the open door in the direction of the rustling noise. And in a moment, the trembling bushes parted and out crawled a dog. He was an Airedale, and he was pulling himself along on 3 legs, whimpering softly. Jess drew a long breath of relief and said to the children, "It's all right, only a dog, but he seems to be hurt." At the sound of her voice, the dog lifted his eyes and wagged his tail feebly. He held up his front foot. "Poor doggy," murmured Jess soothingly as she clambered out of the car. "Let Jess see your poor lame foot." She approached the dog carefully, for she remembered that her mother had always told her never to touch a strange dog unless he wagged his tail. But this dog's tail was wagging certainly, so Jess bent over without fear to look at the paw. An exclamation of pity escaped her when she saw it, for a stiff, sharp thorn had been driven completely through one of the cushions of the dog's foot, and around it the blood had dried. "I guess I can fix that," said Jess briskly, "but taking the thorn out is going to hurt you, old fellow." The dog looked up at her as she laid his paw down and licked her hand. "Come here, Benny and Violet," directed Jess. She took the animal gently in her lap and turned him on his side. She patted his head and stroked his nose with one finger and offered him the rest of her bread crust, which she had put in her apron pocket. The dog snapped it up as if he were nearly starved. Then she held the soft paw firmly with her left hand and pulled steadily on the thorn with her right. The dog did not utter a sound. He lay motionless in her lap until the thorn suddenly let go and lay in Jess's hand. Good, good, said Violet. Wet my handkerchief, Jess ordered briskly. Violet did so, dipping it in the running brook. Jess wrapped the cool, wet folds around the hot paw and gently squeezed it against the wound. The dog, meanwhile, trying to lick her hands. Well, surprise Henry, won't we? Laughed Benny delightedly. Now we got a dog. To be sure, said Jess, struck with the thought, but that isn't what I intended for a surprise. You know, I was tending to get a lot of blueberries and maybe find some old dishes in a dump or something. Can't we look while you hold the dog? Asked Violet anxiously. Of course you can, Pet, said Jess. Look over there by those rocks. Benny and Violet scrambled through the underbrush to the place Jess pointed out and investigated. But they did not hunt long, for the blueberries were so thick that the bushes almost bent over with their weight. Oh, Jessie, screamed Benny, you never saw so many in your life. What'll we pick them into? Come and get a clean towel, said Jess, who noticed that Benny was already picking into his own mouth. But that's just as well, she thought, because he won't get so hungry waiting for the milk. She watched the two children a moment as they dropped handfuls of the bluish globes on the towel. Then she carefully got up with her little patient and went over and sat in the center of the patch. The berries were so thick she did not have to change her position before the towel held over a quart. Oh dear, sighed Jess. I wish I could hunt for some dishes so we could have blueberries and milk. Never mind tonight, said Violet. We can just eat a handful of blueberries and then take a drink of milk when Henry comes. But it was even better than that. For when Henry came, he had 2 bottles of milk under one arm, a huge loaf of brown bread under the other, and some golden cheese in waxed paper in his pocket. But you should have seen Henry stare when he saw what Jess was holding. Where in the world? Began the boy. He came to us, volunteered Benny. He came as a surprise for you, and he's a nice doggy. Henry knelt down to look at the visitor, who wagged his tail. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have a watchdog, said Henry. I worried about you all the time I was gone. Did you bring some milk? Inquired Benny, trying to be polite, but looking at the bottles with longing eyes. Bless his heart, said Jess, struggling to her feet with the dog. We'll have dinner right away. Or is it supper? Call it supper, suggested Henry, for it's the last thing we'll have to eat today. And then tomorrow we'll start having 3 meals every day, laughed Jess. It was certainly a queer meal, whatever it was. Jess, who liked above all things to be orderly, spread out of the big gray laundry bag on the pine needles for a tablecloth. The brown loaf was cut by a very excited little hostess into 5 thick squares, the cheese into 4. Dogs don't eat cheese, Benny remarked cheerfully. The poor little fellow was glad of it too, for he was very hungry. He could hardly wait for Jess to set the milk bottles in the center of the table and heap the blueberries in 4 little mounds, one at each place. I'm sorry we haven't cups, Jess remarked. We'll just have to drink out of the same bottle. No, we won't, said Henry. We'll drink half of each bottle so that we'll make at least 2 things to drink out of. Good for you, Henry, said Jess, much relieved. You and Benny use one, and Violet and I will use the other. So the meal began. Look, Benny, directed Henry, eat a handful of blueberries, then take a bite of brown bread, then a nibble of cheese. Now a drink of milk. It's good, mumbled Benny to himself all through the meal. You must not imagine that the poor wandering dog was neglected, for Jess fed him gently as he lay in her lap, poking morsels of brown bread into his mouth and pouring milk into her own hand for him to lap up. When the meal was over and exactly half of each bottle of milk remained, Jess said, We are going to sleep on beds tonight. Just as soon as we get our beds made, we are all going to be washed. That'll be fun, Benny, added Violet. We'll wash our paws in the brook just the way Cinnamon does. First, let's gather armfuls of dry pine needles, ordered Jess. Get those on top that have been lying in the sunshine. Jess laid the dog down on a bed of moss as she spoke and started energetically to scoop up piles of the fragrant needles. Soon a pile as high as her head stood just under the freight car door. I think we have enough, she said at last. Taking the scissors from Violet's work bag, she cut the laundry bag carefully into 2 pieces, saving the cord for a clothesline. One of the big squares was laid across Benny's hay and tucked under. That was the softest bed of all. Violet's apron and her own she cut off at the belt. I'll sleep next to Benny, said Henry, with my head up by the door. Then I can hear what is going on. A big pile of pine needles was loaded onto the freight car for Henry's bed and covered with the other half of the laundry bag. The remainder of the needles Jess piled in the farthest corner of the car for herself and Violet. We'll all sleep on one side so we can call it the bedroom. What'll be the other side? Inquired Benny. The other side? Repeated Jess. Let me think. I guess that'll be the sitting room and perhaps some of the time the kitchen. On rainy days, maybe the dining room, added Henry with a wink. Couldn't it be the parlor? Begged Benny. Oh, certainly the parlor. We forgot that, agreed Jess, returning the wink. She was covering the last 2 soft beds with the 2 aprons. The tops of these aprons are washcloths, she said severely. Then, armed with the big cake of soap, she led the way to the brook. The dog watched them anxiously, but when Jess said, "Lie still," he obeyed. From the moment Jess drew the thorn from his foot, he was her dog, to obey her slightest command and to follow her wherever she went. The clean, cool brook was delightful even to Benny. The children rolled up their sleeves and plunged their dusty arms into its waters, quarreling good-naturedly over the soap and lathering their stained faces and necks with it. When they were well rinsed with clear water, they dried themselves with the towel. Then Jess washed both towels nicely with soap, rinsed them, and hung them on the clothesline of tape, which she had stretched between 2 slender birch trees. They flapped lazily in the wind. Looks like home already, Jess, said Henry, smiling at the washing. The tired children clambered into the bedroom, Jess coming last with the wounded dog. We'll have to leave the door open. It's so hot, said Henry, lying down with a tired sigh. And in less than 10 minutes, they were fast asleep, dog and all, asleep at 6 o'clock, asleep without naming the dog, without locking the door, without fear, for this was the first night in 4 that they had been able to go to sleep at night, as children should. And that is where we end for today. Join me again next week for another edition of the Weekly Read. We will pick up with chapter 5, which is called Housekeeping. All right, friends, I'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.